Hi, everyone. This is the first talk I've given in person for a long time, so I'm a bit nervous. But yeah, I'm just going to be talking a bit about the preliminary literature review search that Chris mentioned in the very beginning, and just a little bit of a kind of high-level look at biodiversity and infectious diseases in general, just a bit of an overview. That's fine, I'll just click on the screen. Okay, that's fine. Oh, and then this might work. Oh, yes. Okay, cool. Got it. Sweet. So starting off with, I guess, the concept of planetary health. So planetary health is kind of looking at a really big picture system of how aspects of our environment and socioeconomic factors influence, and the health of the planet in general influence the health of people. So, for example, on the left, we've got a lot of indicators of health. So from health science, like cardiac medicine, genetics, and infectious diseases, which is what we're focusing on. And then on the right, my right, no, never mind, you're right as well. Yeah, we've got biodiversity conservation, ecology, oceanography, and everything like that. And the reason these two are overlapping is because a lot of the factors on the right do influence our health, which is what we've heard about earlier today as well. So one of the problems that's often discussed with this kind of research is that there's a huge focus on human utility. So how nature can be used for us, how it serves us, but we often leave out the intrinsic value of biodiversity on its own. And also some of the other functions and services that it provides, so not outside of just infectious diseases, for example. But biodiversity infectious disease links are slowly gaining coverage and funding. So for example, the IPBS, which I had notes for what it actually stood for, but I've completely forgotten. But ecological services is the last two. And then also the World Health Organization's Convention of Biodiversity. And both of these organizations talk a lot about the links between biodiversity and infectious diseases. And Esther will be talking a bit more about planetary health as well. So on top of that, we also have a biodiversity crisis, which if you're from the ecology or conservation space, which is where my background is actually from, you'll probably be pretty familiar with this. So we're seeing the extreme loss of species and habitats at a global scale. And that's within species and between species as well. So we're losing a lot of these unique animals and habitats completely off the face of the earth. And this is due to a lot of human activity. So things like overexploitation of organisms like fishing or land use change, pollution, invasive species, and climate change. But there is unfortunately limited motivation, limited resources, and funding for biodiversity management a lot of the time. But what we're talking about today and everything is looking at some of the shared risk factors and drivers potentially between biodiversity loss and infectious diseases in humans. So one of the ways to look at this could be through pathogen spillover. So that's looking at how infectious diseases actually start from either the environment or from an animal host and then transfer onto humans. And there's a lot of barriers in place, basically, for it to transfer and get to that stage. And at a lot of these barriers and these stages, you can actually kind of put a plug or a stop and hopefully interfere with the transmission process is the goal. So sometimes you talk about the infect, shed, spill, and spread cycle. So essentially what you need is some kind of reservoir or the environment which has that pathogen in it. And that depends on how dense the organisms are, or maybe the distribution of the organisms or the water bases or soil, whatever kind of host of the pathogen you're looking at. Then there's a pathogen prevalence in that and infection intensity or the shedding and the pathogen survival. So how well it actually survives in the host or in the environment on its own. And then the contact between humans and that host or reservoir as well. And then how susceptible they are to infection. So you can be exposed to pathogen, but not necessarily become infected as well. So, you know, big cases that we see are avian influenza, COVID-19, and Ebola, which we've kind of talked about a little bit as well before. And Hamish, who is on the line, I think, has actually contributed to this. So any comments from him at the end, that'd be great about this, if I've incorrectly disseminated that information. But yeah, basically I've just put in this image here. We've got a lot of different kinds of places that pathogens can be and that humans can make contact with it to get infected. So there's things like mosquitoes, dogs, mammals, and then just water and soil and then all of the interactions between those things, and then how that plays into the interface between people and how susceptible people are to getting infected. We've got a lot of drivers of this kind of barrier system. So there's a lot of arrows here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the whole gist of what I was trying to get at is this is pretty complicated. We've got a lot of factors of environmental change that are also contributing to biodiversity loss, that are contributing to pathogen emergence or susceptibility to infection, or the spillover to humans, or the density of reservoirs. So for example, you've got land use change, which can have a huge impact on how reservoirs are interacting with each other. So you can have the crowding of organisms or the movement of organisms from parks into human spaces, and also climate change impacts, which we discussed a little bit before as well. But those can be really difficult to figure out how it's actually going to cause a difference into this spillover process. And then also the loss of predators and scavengers and how that impacts pathogen prevalence, or how many hosts or reservoirs there are, which Chris will talk about a little bit as well. Then we've also got other connections, so the dilution effect, which Hamish talked about, and its contentious origins and stuff. Then we've got agriculture and domestic animals. So, and how that can be a middle ground or a maintenance population. Sorry, it can be the bridging population between wild animals and humans. And then we've also got nutrition, safety, and well-being, which is something that a lot of people might not talk about, or maybe I hadn't heard about this before looking into it too deeply, which is how biodiversity actually supports the nutrition, safety, and well-being of people. And if through biodiversity loss, you can actually reduce people's resilience against infection, so they can be more susceptible. And then also biodiversity is a great source of medical resources. So for example, antibiotics, antivirals. Cool, but something we did touch on a little bit earlier in some of our talks was some of the trade-offs. So what we're seeing in some of the management techniques for diseases, or even for biodiversity, is that you end up with perverse outcomes for either biodiversity or for human health. So this is something that we thought was pretty interesting, is what can happen is if you put in a management strategy, it can be ineffective, which is kind of a perverse outcome. But there's often very limited funding for both of these schools. Then there's also degrading biodiversity through human health interventions, which is unintentional, but often human health is prioritized. And then also increasing disease risk unintentionally through some conservation action or trying to avoid biodiversity loss. So this often happens where key interventions are difficult to install. So for example, if vaccination is pretty difficult to install or distribute, or for example, there are no native predators, if there's no room that we can see at the moment for co-management, then we might accidentally see some of these perverse outcomes. So another thing is a limited understanding of the reservoir ecology. So I've got another slide with some of the examples here. So for example, in Latin America, vampire bats can transfer rabies into people. And one of the strategies of actually dealing with this can be culling of bats. And so that can be done through sealing of caves or through burning of caves. And what happens there is you get indiscriminate loss of bats. So it's not necessarily targeted. And also some research shows that it's not necessarily that effective. So it might not actually impact how well it might not actually impact how prevalent the disease is within bats and how well it transfers out to people. But so that is a huge biodiversity loss for people. Some of those bat species are also really important pollinators. So that's an ecosystem service for people as well that we're losing on top of biodiversity. Then in areas in South Africa, we've got wetlands, which are, there's a program and initiative to conserve or rehabilitate wetlands. And that is for the purposes of managing sewage effluent as well. So it's purifying water. But there's contention and some debate around whether that'll increase malaria risk by installing those. So that's an example of a conservation installation or intervention potentially impacting disease. Then also there's the case in some European countries where there's been the mass rabies vaccination of foxes. And that has been great at reducing rabies-mediated human infection. Yes, yeah. But unfortunately, what happened after that is that the fox populations did really well. So they are native to the area. They did really well. And what they're finding is more echinococcus. I think someone did say that in one of the earlier talks. And I was like, oh, great. I know how to pronounce that now, but I've just completely forgotten. But yeah, so what they're finding is increases in that disease as well in the fox population. So you might end up with, especially with these complicated multi-host pathogens. So if a pathogen has lots of different hosts that it can live in, or maybe an animal can be infected by lots of different human diseases as well. You get really complicated trade-offs and networks that can happen. And it's often really difficult to figure out what is actually the outcome of an intervention. Cool. So this is where I guess a lot of us have been talking about integrated management as a form of kind of trying to get at some kind of a solution that might benefit both biodiversity and human health, or at least not negatively impact one or the other. So what this would involve is the sharing of resources, knowledge, funding to create win-wins. So we've heard of a great database, which is all about pooling resources and information as well, and other great initiatives. So this requires a really good understanding of epidemiology of each of the diseases, which we've talked about. So how exactly is it transmitted, what the reservoirs are, and the ecological drivers. So for example, if a host, for example, has an important predator, if that's relevant to conserve. So understanding each system, it can be very, very case specific when installing a kind of intervention strategy. So all of this kind of integrated management and talking to across different schools and working together to pool resources and funding will hopefully safeguard against any perverse outcomes for biodiversity or human health, and also saves ineffective use of limited resources. So we've kind of started putting together a few of these integrated management techniques. A lot of these are theoretical, so ideas that people have come up with. Oh, thank you. Great. Skip over that. I was just meant to talk about it anyway, so it's there. We'd love any contribution if you have any examples of that. But here's one case study that we thought was really interesting. So I have no idea how to say this. Schistosomiasis, I've only read it. But that and prawns. So in the Senegal River, there's a dam that was installed, and what happened is it actually blocked brackish water from coming upstream. And it also blocked the population of native prawns from coming upstream. And what ended up happening is they had a huge outbreak of this disease. So this disease is transferred from this like little freshwater snail. And the little freshwater snail sheds a bunch of this pathogen into the water, and anyone using the water might be infected. So when the prawns were blocked from that habitat and all the habitat upstream became really still, lots of algae, no predators, the snails boomed. And so we had like persistent outbreaks of this disease, so endemic infections of this disease, and elimination was really difficult, even though there is preventative treatment. So you can get preventative chemotherapy to treat this disease, but active elimination was quite difficult to achieve. So what they did was they actually reintroduced native prawns upstream into areas where people were using the river. And what they found was that it reduced host numbers, so there was less snails, there was less pathogen, and there were less infections. So it was a really great success story of this integrated solution. So conserving native prawns, bringing them back into the habitat, and also reducing disease through very specific knowledge of how the disease actually is transferred onto people. Cool. And then this is talking a little bit more about what Stacey and Aaron mentioned in their discussion. So this is my PhD. I'm helping out with this project. And what I'm looking at is a subset of the whole WISH project, which is specifically outbreaks of leptospirosis, typhoid, and dengue, water-associated diseases in catchments in Fiji, and looking at how sediment and other processes that happen on land might interfere with coastal ecosystems downstream, and also outbreaks on land. Outbreaks of those three diseases. So what we're looking at, and what we've also been talking about a lot, which is great to hear, is the integrated systems approach. So, and that's really nested. So at all those different scales. So for this, I'm looking at more of the infrastructure improvements. So for example, improvements with sewage, or rehabilitation of forests, riparian vegetation, to try to stop so much soil, which can host disease from going downstream, and also damaging coral reefs. But then we also have to look at every single level of that. So that's only one part of the system. If we just installed that, there wouldn't be that many benefits for human health. We'd also have to look at behavior management and land use management as well. So looking at, and global management. So looking at collaborating with all of those different fields to try to get shared benefits. But by having our foot into this human health area, we can also kind of leverage a bit more funding for biodiversity benefits as well, while getting simultaneous benefits for people. Cool. And then we've also got the Hendra virus flying fox. Am I okay for time? Is it Yeah, 2 minutes, cool. So this is something that Alison Peel, who's on the line, I think, has worked a lot on, and Hamish as well. So really cool work. Thank you for providing some of the papers for this. But it was discussed a little bit. So how flying foxes are kind of being, flying foxes, which are one of the reservoirs for Hendra virus, what happens is they interact with horses through contaminating troughs or food sources with their feces, which is contaminated with Hendra virus. And then the horses can get Hendra, which can then pass it on to people as well. So changes with the habitat of these, and habitat and food sources for these bats basically causes a lot of stress. So they end up actually shedding more of this pathogen than normal. And they also end up moving into areas where they have more contact with horses and more contact with people. So what the deforestation of their habitat has actually caused is them impinging on people's spaces and spreading more of this disease. So there's a potential conservation action here where on top of the normal vaccination for Hendra, if you wanted to kind of limit more bigger outbreaks, you could also protect their habitat and maintain that kind of distance between the bat populations and horses and people. Then we've got lots of areas to go into the future for this. So what we're putting together in some of the stuff we're reading is different scales. That's already been talked about as well. So, and how monitoring biodiversity benefits is often done at really different scales to disease reductions. So biodiversity, for example, rehabilitating a forest can take decades or more, potentially hundreds of years, and disease reductions, some, especially depending on how much resources you're putting in, you want results a lot faster. So how do we navigate the different kinds of scales that are needed, especially for people to buy in? And also the influence of biodiversity, which is often quite at a local scale. Cool. And then collaboration across sectors and scales, which we talked about as well, and looking at how that's nested. We also have a very limited understanding of epidemiology, so the multi-host diseases, emerging diseases, and the indirect biodiversity benefits. So things like how does biodiversity's assistance with providing nutrition help prevent disease, and how do we model for that or account for that? Cool. I think that's it.